Hello and welcome to Only in History Bedtime Stories. Tonight we journey to a small, rocky peninsula jutting into the wind-dark sea, to a world of white marble columns and olive groves, of open-air debates in sun-drenched squares and torchlit philosophical schools. We travel to ancient Greece, not to witness the famous battles or the rise of empires, but to explore something far more fragile and far more profound, the birth of a new way of thinking about the world, the emergence of philosophy, science, and reason as we understand them today. For a brief, brilliant period spanning roughly 3 centuries, from around 600 to 300 BCE, a handful of cities in Greece became home to a revolution in human thought. Here, for the first time in history, people began to question the old explanations handed down by priests and poets. They began to seek natural causes for natural events. They began to ask not just what the gods decreed, but what the universe itself was made of, how it worked, and what role human beings played in the vast cosmic order. This intellectual awakening produced some of the greatest minds humanity has ever known. Socrates, who taught that the unexamined life was not worth living. Plato, who imagined an ideal world of perfect forms beyond the imperfect shadows we perceive. Aristotle, who catalogued the natural world with unprecedented systematicity and created the foundations of formal logic. These were the first great minds of Europe, the pioneers who opened paths of inquiry that we still walk today. But this golden age did not last. The world that nurtured these philosophers was fragile, dependent on a delicate balance of political freedom, economic prosperity, and cultural confidence. And when that balance was destroyed, first by the long, bitter war between Athens and Sparta, and then by the conquest of Greece by foreign powers, the great philosophical schools began to change, to turn inward, to lose the optimistic belief that reason could transform the world. Tonight, we will tell the story of this rise and this collapse. We will meet the philosophers in their own cities, in their own time, and understand the questions that drove them. We will explore the unique conditions that made Greece the birthplace of Western philosophy, and we will trace the long, slow twilight as the light of free inquiry dimmed, and the schools that had once sought to understand the cosmos turned instead to teaching their students how to endure a world they could no longer hope to change. But before we begin this journey through the landscape of ideas, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It's a simple and wonderful way to support these bedtime stories from history, and it means a great deal to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight. So I'd really love to hear from you in the comments. And now, settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away. Let us walk together through the streets of ancient Athens, sit in the shade of the Athenian Stoa, and listen to the conversations that changed the world before wonder. Why Greece, and why then to understand the miracle of Greek philosophy? We must first understand the world that came before it, a world where all the great civilizations of the Mediterranean and Near East explained the workings of nature, through the actions of gods, spirits, and supernatural forces. In Egypt, the Nile flooded because the gods willed it. In Mesopotamia, thunder was the voice of angry deities. In every culture, from India to Scandinavia, the default explanation for why things happened was divine intervention. This was not ignorance. These were sophisticated civilizations with advanced mathematics, impressive architecture, and complex social organization. But their explanatory framework was fundamentally religious. The universe was governed by the whims, the conflicts, and the passions of immortal beings who could not be fully understood or predicted by mortal minds. The role of the priest was to interpret the will of the gods, to perform the correct rituals, and to maintain the cosmic order through sacrifice and prayer. And then, on the western coast of what is now Turkey, in a string of Greek colonies known as Ionia, something changed. Sometime around 600 BCE, a wealthy merchant named Thales of Miletus began to ask a different kind of question. He did not ask which god caused earthquakes. He asked what the earth itself was made of, what substance underlay all the apparent diversity of the material world. His answer, that everything was ultimately made of water, seems almost laughably primitive to us now. But the answer itself was less important than the question. Thales was proposing that the universe could be understood in natural terms, that there were consistent, impersonal principles governing how things worked, and that human reason, without divine revelation, could discover those principles. This was revolutionary. For the first time in recorded history, someone was suggesting that you did not need to consult a priest or interpret an oracle to understand why the world was the way it was. You could observe, you could think, you could reason. The universe was not arbitrary, it was rational, and the human mind, properly applied, could grasp its underlying order. But why did this happen in Greece and not somewhere else? Why did this intellectual revolution begin in the small, relatively poor cities of Ionia, rather than in the vastly wealthier and more powerful empires of Egypt or Persia? The answer lies in a unique combination of factors. First, geography. Greece was not a unified kingdom, but a collection of hundreds of independent city-states, scattered across a mountainous peninsula and the islands of the Aegean Sea. The terrain made large-scale political unity nearly impossible. Each city, each polis, governed itself, developed its own laws, and competed with its neighbors for resources, prestige, and power. This fragmentation had a profound effect on Greek culture. Unlike the great river valley civilizations of Egypt or Mesopotamia, where a centralized priesthood controlled knowledge and education, in Greece there was no single religious authority. Each city had its own cults, its own temples, its own myths, and because the cities competed with one another, they were open to new ideas, new practices, anything that might give them an advantage. Second, trade. The Greeks were not a land-based empire. They were a maritime people, sailors and traders who traveled throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. They encountered Egyptians, Phoenicians, Persians, and countless other cultures. They saw that different peoples had different gods, different customs, different explanations for the same phenomena. This exposure to diversity created a kind of intellectual relativism, a recognition that the stories told in one's own city were not the only possible stories. That truth might lie elsewhere or might need to be discovered rather than simply inherited. Third, and perhaps most importantly, politics. Many of the Greek city-states, and Athens most famously, developed a new form of government called democracia, ruled by the people. In a democracy, decisions were made not by a king or a priest, but by citizens debating in the assembly. Persuasion, argument, and the ability to think clearly and speak convincingly became essential skills. This political culture created a demand for education in rhetoric and logic, and it created a tolerance, indeed an appreciation, for questioning and debate. In Athens, a young man could stand in the agora and challenge the traditional stories about the gods, and rather than being executed for blasphemy, he might attract a crowd of curious listeners. This openness to free inquiry, this willingness to question inherited assumptions, was the fertile soil in which philosophy could take root and flourish. So the Greek miracle was not a miracle at all. It was the product of specific, identifiable historical conditions. a fragmented political landscape that prevented the rise of a monolithic priesthood, a maritime trading culture that exposed Greeks to diverse ideas, and a democratic political system that valued debate and rewarded clear thinking. These conditions came together in a rare and precious combination, and the result was the birth of philosophy, the first philosophers, the men who asked what the world was made of. The earliest Greek philosophers are known to us today as the Pre-Socratics, not because they all lived before Socrates, but because their concerns were different from his. While Socrates would focus on ethics and the question of how to live, the Pre-Socratics were interested in physics and cosmology. They wanted to understand the fundamental nature of reality itself. These were not professional academics. Most of them were wealthy men, merchants or aristocrats who had the leisure to think and the independence to question. And they came from the edges of the Greek world, from Ionia and southern Italy, from places where Greek culture met other civilizations and where new ideas could flourish away from the conservative traditions of the old cities. Thales of Miletus, as we have seen, proposed that water was the fundamental substance. His reasoning was observational. Water could exist in three states: solid ice, liquid water, and gaseous steam. It seemed to be everywhere, in the earth, in living things, in the sky. Perhaps, he reasoned, all the apparent diversity of matter was just water in different forms. His student Anaximander disagreed. He argued that the fundamental substance could not be anything we could directly observe, like water or fire. It had to be something more basic, something he called the apeiron, the boundless or the infinite. From this formless, infinite substance, all the specific things in the world emerged through a process of separation and would eventually return to it. Anaximander also proposed something remarkable for his time. He suggested that the earth was not a flat disk resting on water or held up by pillars, as most ancient cultures believed, but a cylinder floating freely in space, held in place by being equidistant from all other celestial bodies. He was wrong in the details, but the method was sound. He was using pure reason to go beyond what could be directly observed, constructing a model of the cosmos that was consistent with the available evidence. Another of Thales' students, Anaximenes, proposed that air was the fundamental substance. When air was compressed, it became water, and when compressed further, it became earth and rock. When it was rarefied, it became fire. This was the first attempt at what we might call a unified field theory, a single principle that could explain all physical transformations. These Milesian philosophers, as they are called, were doing something genuinely new. They were not appealing to the gods. They were not quoting ancient texts. They were observing the world, thinking about what they observed, and proposing explanations that other people could examine, challenge, and improve upon. They had discovered the scientific method, though they lacked the tools and techniques that would come much later. Across the Greek world, in the colonies of southern Italy, another group of thinkers was developing a very different approach. Pythagoras of Samos, who founded a philosophical and religious community in the city of Croton, made a discovery that would shape Western thought for 2,000 years. He discovered that mathematics was the key to understanding nature. According to the stories, Pythagoras was walking past a blacksmith's shop when he noticed that hammers of different weights produced different musical tones when they struck the anvil. He investigated and discovered that the intervals between musical notes corresponded to simple mathematical ratios. An octave was a ratio of 2:1. A perfect fifth was 3:2. The universe, Pythagoras realized, was not just rational but mathematical. Number was the underlying reality. This insight led Pythagoras and his followers into a kind of mystical numerology that seems strange to us today. They believed that numbers had spiritual significance, that certain numbers were sacred, and that the soul could be purified through the study of mathematics. But beneath the mysticism was a profound truth. The universe could be described in mathematical language, and that description could reveal patterns and relationships invisible to the unaided senses. Another southern Italian philosopher, Heraclitus of Ephesus, focused not on what the world was made of, but on the fact that it was constantly changing. "You cannot step into the same river twice," he famously said. "4 fresh waters are ever flowing in upon you." Everything, Heraclitus believed, was in constant flux, constantly transforming from one state to another. The fundamental principle of the universe was not a substance but a process, which he called fire, not the literal flames but the principle of change itself. His contemporary Parmenides of Ionia took the exact opposite view. Change, Parmenides argued, was an illusion. Reality, true reality, was unchanging and eternal. Our senses told us that things came into being and passed away, but reason told us this was impossible. For something to come into being, it must come from nothing. But nothing, by definition, does not exist. Therefore, nothing can come from it. Therefore, reality must be eternal, unchanging, and indivisible. This was a shocking conclusion, one that seemed to contradict all of human experience. But Parmenides argued that we should trust reason over the senses, that the appearances were deceptive and only logic could reveal the truth. His ideas would profoundly influence Plato and would remain a challenge to philosophers for centuries. The Pre-Socratics did not reach a consensus. They disagreed profoundly about the nature of reality, but their disagreements were productive. Each philosopher built on, criticized, or refined the ideas of those who came before. They had discovered something essential, that truth was not handed down from the gods, but discovered through observation, argument, and reason. The conversation had begun, and it would continue for centuries. The man who knew nothing, Socrates and the birth of ethics. As the 5th century BCE progressed, the focus of Greek philosophy began to shift. The grand cosmological questions, what is the universe made of, how did it begin, what governs the stars, began to seem less urgent. A new generation of thinkers turned their attention to a different set of problems. How should human beings live? What makes an action right or wrong? What is justice? What is virtue? This shift was partly a response to political and social changes. Athens, having defeated the Persian invasion and established itself as the dominant power in the Aegean, had become a vibrant, wealthy democracy. The assembly met regularly to debate policy, and the law courts were constantly filled with citizens prosecuting and defending one another. In this environment, the ability to argue persuasively became immensely valuable. A new class of professional teachers emerged, known as the Sophists. These were traveling intellectuals who, for a fee, would teach young men the art of rhetoric, the skill of making the weaker argument appear the stronger. The Sophists were controversial. Their critics accused them of teaching moral relativism, of suggesting that there was no objective truth or justice, only persuasion and power. Whether this criticism was fair is debatable, but it set the stage for the appearance of philosophy's most famous and most enigmatic figure. Socrates was born in Athens around 470 BCE, the son of a stonemason and a midwife. He served as a hoplite, a heavily armed infantryman, in several military campaigns, and was known for his physical toughness and his indifference to hardship. But his true calling was not war, but conversation. Socrates spent his days in the agora, the central marketplace of Athens, engaging anyone who would listen in philosophical dialogue. He wrote nothing. Everything we know about him comes from the writings of his students, primarily Plato, and from the satirical plays of Aristophanes, who mocked him as a typical sophist. But Socrates insisted he was not a sophist. He did not claim to teach anything, and he refused to accept payment. He claimed, in fact, to know nothing at all. This claim of ignorance was not false modesty. It was the foundation of his method. Socrates would approach someone, often a prominent citizen who claimed expertise in some area, ethics, politics, or piety, and he would ask them to define the virtue they claimed to understand. What is justice? What is courage? What is piety? The person would offer a definition, and Socrates would then ask a series of questions, gently probing the definition, revealing contradictions and inconsistencies, until the person was forced to admit that they did not, in fact, know what they were talking about. This method, which came to be called the Socratic method or elenchus, was not designed to humiliate but to educate. Socrates believed that the first step toward wisdom was recognizing one's own ignorance. As long as you believed you already knew the truth, you would never seek it. But once you admitted your ignorance, you could begin the genuine work of philosophy, the cooperative search for truth through dialogue and reason. Socrates' questions were not abstract. They were intensely practical, focused on how one should live. He believed that virtue was knowledge, that if you truly understood what was good, you would naturally do it, and that vice was simply ignorance. This was a radical claim. It suggested that ethics could be taught, that moral improvement was possible through education, and that the key to a good life was philosophy. His constant questioning made him many enemies. The powerful men of Athens did not appreciate being made to look foolish in public, and his association with several young aristocrats who later betrayed the city made him politically suspect. In 399 BCE, when Socrates was 70 years old, he was brought to trial on charges of impiety and corrupting the youth. The trial was a mockery. The accusations were vague, and the real motivation was political. But Socrates refused to play the game. He refused to beg for mercy, refused to propose a reasonable penalty, and instead used his trial as an opportunity to defend the philosophical life. He told the jury that the unexamined life was not worth living, that his work in Athens had been a service to the city, waking it up like a gadfly stinging a lazy horse. The jury convicted him and sentenced him to death. Socrates' friends arranged for his escape, but he refused. He had lived his entire life arguing that one must obey the laws of the city. To flee now would be to betray everything he had stood for. And so, surrounded by his students, Socrates drank the cup of hemlock poison and died, still talking, still questioning, still seeking the truth. His death was a tragedy, but it was also a triumph. It demonstrated that philosophy was not just intellectual play, but a way of life, a commitment so deep that one would die for it rather than abandon it. And it ensured that Socrates would never be forgotten, that his method and his questions would echo through the centuries, inspiring every generation that came after. The Academy and the Forms. Plato's vision of perfect truth, Among the young men who gathered around Socrates in his final hours was a brilliant aristocrat named Plato. The death of his teacher devastated Plato and convinced him that Athens, with its unstable democracy and its susceptibility to rhetoric and emotion, was a fundamentally unjust city. For the rest of his life, Plato would be haunted by the question, how could a good man be condemned to death by a legal process? What was wrong with Athenian society, and how could it be fixed? Plato left Athens for several years, traveling to Egypt, Italy, and Sicily, studying with other philosophers and trying to make sense of what had happened. When he returned to Athens around 387 BCE, he founded a school, the Academy, on a plot of land sacred to the hero Achilles. It would become the most influential educational institution in the ancient world, surviving for over 900 years until it was finally closed by the Christian Emperor Justinian in 529 CE at the Academy. Plato taught through dialogue, continuing the Socratic method but recording these conversations in written form. His dialogues, which survive almost complete, are among the greatest works of Western literature, dramatizing philosophical arguments through vivid characters and memorable imagery. And at the heart of Plato's philosophy was a radical idea that the world we see around us, the world of physical objects and sensory experience, is not the true reality but only a shadow, an imperfect copy of a higher realm of perfect, eternal, unchanging forms. The theory of forms is Plato's most famous and most difficult idea. It begins with a simple observation. If you look at 3 different horses, they are all different in size, color, and shape, and yet we recognize them all as horses. Why? Because, Plato argued, they all participate in or resemble the form of horse, a perfect, ideal horse that exists not in the physical world, but in a transcendent realm accessible only to the intellect. The same is true for every category of thing. There is a form of chair, a form of tree, a form of triangle, and most importantly, there are forms of ethical concepts, a form of justice, a form of beauty, a form of the good. These forms are not invented by human beings. They are discovered. They are objective, eternal truths that exist whether we know them or not. Plato illustrated this idea with his famous allegory of the cave. Imagine, he said, a group of prisoners chained in a dark cave since childhood, facing a wall. Behind them is a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners, people carry objects, casting shadows on the wall. The prisoners, having never seen anything else, believe the shadows are reality. If one prisoner were freed and forced to turn around, he would see the fire and the objects and realize that the shadows were only images. And if he were dragged out of the cave into the sunlight, he would at first be blinded, but gradually his eyes would adjust and he would see the real world illuminated by the sun. The cave, Plato explained, represents the physical world. The shadows are the imperfect, changeable things we perceive with our senses. The fire represents the illusions we mistake for truth, and the sun represents the form of the good, the ultimate source of truth and reality. The philosopher is the prisoner who escapes the cave, who through reason and education comes to perceive the forms and understand true reality. This had profound implications for politics. Plato argued that the ideal city should be ruled not by the people, as in a democracy, but by philosopher kings, individuals who had escaped the cave, who understood the forms, and who could therefore govern justly. The death of Socrates had convinced Plato that democracy was mob rule, that the average person was trapped in the cave of ignorance and could not be trusted to make important decisions. He outlined this vision in his most famous work, The Republic, a long, complex dialogue that is part political philosophy, part ethics, part metaphysics, and part psychology. It describes an ideal city where everyone performs the role they are naturally suited for, where private property is abolished for the ruling class to prevent corruption, and where education is rigorous and designed to produce citizens who love truth more than pleasure. The Republic has been enormously influential, but it has also been controversial. Critics, from Aristotle onward, have argued that Plato's ideal city is a rigid, totalitarian nightmare where individual freedom is sacrificed to an abstract ideal. Others have seen it not as a blueprint for an actual state, but as an allegory for the individual soul, where reason must govern the passions. Whatever the correct interpretation, Plato's vision of philosophy was clear. Philosophy was not just an intellectual exercise. It was the path to truth, to justice, and to the good life. And the forms, those perfect, eternal ideals, were the guiding stars that could lead humanity out of the cave of ignorance and into the light of genuine knowledge. Asterisk, asterisk, the systematic mind, Aristotle and the organization of knowledge, asterisk, asterisk. Plato's most famous student was a young man from the northern Greek kingdom of Macedon named Aristotle. He arrived at the academy at age 17 and remained there for 20 years until Plato's death. But Aristotle was not content to simply absorb his teacher's ideas. He was a profoundly different kind of thinker, more interested in the physical world than in transcendent forms, more focused on observation and classification than on abstract reasoning. When Plato died, Aristotle left Athens and spent several years traveling and conducting biological research, particularly marine biology, on the island of Lesbos. He dissected animals, catalogued species, and made observations that would not be surpassed for 2,000 years. His work was not just descriptive, but explanatory. He wanted to understand not just what living things looked like, but how they functioned, how they reproduced, how they developed. In 343 BCE, Aristotle was invited by King Philip II of Macedon to become the tutor to his 13-year-old son, Alexander. For 3 years, Aristotle taught the boy who would become Alexander the Great, though what exactly he taught him is unknown. When Alexander succeeded his father and embarked on his conquest of the Persian Empire, Aristotle returned to Athens and founded his own school, the Lyceum. The Lyceum was very different from Plato's academy, where Plato had focused on abstract mathematics and dialectic. Aristotle focused on empirical observation and systematic classification. His students collected specimens, compiled histories, and studied everything from biology and physics to politics and poetry. Aristotle himself was astonishingly prolific, writing on virtually every subject known to the ancient world. His approach to philosophy was fundamentally different from Plato's. Aristotle rejected the theory of forms. He argued that universals, the qualities that things have in common, do not exist in some separate realm. They exist in the things themselves. The hoarseness of a horse is not a separate form, but a quality present in every actual horse. Reality, Aristotle insisted, was not up there in some transcendent realm, but right here. In the physical world we can see and touch. He developed a framework for understanding change and causation that would dominate Western thought for centuries. According to Aristotle, every physical thing is composed of matter, the stuff it is made of, and form, the structure or organization that makes it what it is. Change occurs when matter takes on a new form. A block of marble becomes a statue when the sculptor imposes a new form on the matter. Aristotle also identified 4 types of causes that could explain why something exists or happens. The material cause, what something is made of. The formal cause, its structure or essence. The efficient cause, what brought it into being. And the final cause, its purpose or goal. A statue's material cause is marble, its formal cause is its shape, its efficient cause is the sculptor, and its final cause is to honor a god or beautify a public space. This framework of 4 causes was particularly important for biology. Aristotle believed that every living thing had a telos, a natural end or purpose toward which it developed. An acorn's telos was to become an oak tree. A child's telos was to become a fully developed human being. This teleological view of nature would later create problems when it was applied to physics, but in biology it produced genuinely insightful work. Perhaps Aristotle's most lasting contribution was his invention of formal logic. He identified the basic patterns of valid reasoning, the forms of argument that guarantee that if the premises are true, the conclusion must also be true. His work on the syllogism, the three-part argument form, became the foundation of all subsequent logic until the 19th century. A classic example: all men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. This is a valid syllogism. If the first two statements are true, the conclusion must be true. Aristotle catalogued all the valid forms of syllogism and showed how complex arguments could be broken down into simple, logical steps. But Aristotle was not just a philosopher and scientist. He also wrote on ethics and politics. His Nicomachean Ethics, possibly lectures compiled by his son, remains one of the most readable and influential works of moral philosophy. Aristotle argued that the goal of human life was eudaimonia, often translated as happiness but better understood as flourishing or living well. How do we achieve eudaimonia? By developing virtue, arete excellence of character. And how do we develop virtue? Through habit and practice. Courage is not something you are born with. It is something you develop by repeatedly doing courageous acts until courage becomes part of your character. Virtue, for Aristotle, is a mean between extremes. Courage is the mean between cowardice and recklessness. Generosity is the mean between stinginess and wastefulness. This practical, moderate approach to ethics was very different from Plato's focus on abstract ideals. Aristotle was interested in how real people in real situations could live better lives. His philosophy was a toolkit for human flourishing, grounded in observation of how people actually behaved rather than in speculation about perfect forms. Aristotle died in 320 to BCE, and his vast body of work became the foundation of European and Islamic philosophy for nearly 2 millennia. He had systematized knowledge, organized it into disciplines, and provided methods for pursuing truth in each area. He had shown that philosophy was not just about asking questions, but about constructing answers, building systems of thought that could explain the world in all its complexity. Asterisk, asterisk, the long shadow. How war changed everything, asterisk, asterisk, the golden age of Greek philosophy, from Socrates to Aristotle, took place against a backdrop of political turbulence that would ultimately destroy the world that had nurtured it. At the beginning of the 5th century BCE, the Greek city-states, led by Athens and Sparta, had united to defeat the massive invasion by the Persian Empire. This victory filled the Greeks, and especially the Athenians, with confidence. They believed their culture, their way of life, was superior to all others. But the alliance between Athens and Sparta did not survive the external threat. The two cities represented fundamentally different ways of organizing society. Athens was a naval power, a democracy, a city of traders, artists, and philosophers. Sparta was a land power, an oligarchy, a militarized state where citizen soldiers lived in communal barracks and devoted their entire lives to war. In 431 BCE, these two visions of Greek life went to war with each other. The Peloponnesian War, as it came to be known, lasted for 27 years and devastated Greece. Athens suffered a catastrophic plague that killed perhaps 1/3 of its population, including its great leader Heraclitus. Sparta ravaged the Athenian countryside. The war spread throughout the Greek world, drawing in nearly every city-state and destroying the prosperity and confidence that had made the philosophical revolution possible. The historian Thucydides, who lived through the war and chronicled it, saw it as a tragedy of miscalculation and pride. He documented how the war brutalized the Greeks, how civilized norms broke down, how cities that had once prided themselves on their justice committed atrocities. The war did not end decisively. It simply ground both sides down until Athens, its navy destroyed and its people starving, surrendered in 404 BCE. The world that emerged from the Peloponnesian War was a darker, more cynical place. The optimism of the early 5th century, the belief that reason and democracy could create a better world, had been shattered. Sparta's victory proved short-lived. Within decades, a new power emerged. Macedon, a semi-Greek kingdom to the north that most Greeks had previously considered barbaric. Under King Philip II and his son Alexander, Macedon conquered all of Greece and then turned east, shattering the Persian Empire and creating an empire that stretched from Greece to India. Alexander died young at 32, and his empire immediately broke apart into warring kingdoms ruled by his generals. But the world Alexander created, the Hellenistic world, was profoundly different from the classical Greek world of the city-states, the small, independent polis, where a citizen could participate in government and feel that his voice mattered, was replaced by vast kingdoms ruled by distant monarchs. The average person had no political power, no sense that they could shape their own destiny or influence the course of events. The loss of political freedom had a profound effect on philosophy. The Hellenistic philosophers, the thinkers who came after Aristotle, were no longer interested in grand questions about the nature of reality or the ideal organization of the state. Those questions seemed irrelevant in a world where political participation was impossible and where the individual was powerless before the massive forces of empires and armies. Instead, the Hellenistic philosophers turned inward. They asked, how can an individual find peace, happiness, and stability in a world of chaos and suffering? The great schools of the Hellenistic period, Stoicism, Epicureanism, and Skepticism, were all in different ways philosophies of consolation, attempts to teach people how to endure a world they could not change. Philosophy had not died, but it had transformed. It had become a therapy for the soul rather than a path to transforming society. The gardens of retreat, Epicurus and the quiet life in the chaotic years following Alexander's death. A philosopher named Epicurus founded a school in Athens that was unlike any that had come before. Rather than meeting in a public building or gymnasium, Epicurus and his followers retreated from the city to a private garden, a walled enclosure where they could live in community, away from the noise and violence of the wider world. Above the entrance to the garden, as the school came to be known, was inscribed a welcoming message. Stranger, here you will do well to tarry. Here our highest good is pleasure. This last word, pleasure, has caused endless misunderstanding. Critics accused Epicurus of teaching hedonism, of encouraging his followers to pursue wine, sex, and luxury. But this was a profound misrepresentation. For Epicurus, pleasure did not mean indulgence. It meant the absence of pain and disturbance. The highest pleasure, he taught, was ataraxia, tranquility of mind, and the path to tranquility was not through accumulating possessions or chasing intense experiences, but through simplicity, friendship, and freedom from fear. Epicurus identified two great sources of human unhappiness, the fear of the gods and the fear of death. Both, he argued, were based on misunderstandings. The gods, if they existed at all, were perfectly happy beings who lived in a state of eternal bliss and had no interest in human affairs. They did not send plagues or reward virtue or punish vice. The universe operated according to natural laws, not divine whims. As for death, Epicurus offered a simple argument. Death is the cessation of sensation. When we are alive, death is not present. When death is present, we are not. Therefore, death is nothing to us. We cannot experience our own death, so why should we fear it? All the suffering we might imagine in death, the darkness, the loneliness, these are fantasies. Death itself is simply non-existence, and non-existence cannot harm us. Freed from these two great fears, a person could focus on what truly mattered, cultivating friendships, enjoying simple pleasures, studying philosophy to understand the world, and living a quiet, peaceful life away from the turbulent public sphere. Epicurus himself lived simply. His community grew much of its own food. The members shared meals and conversation. They welcomed women and slaves as equals, a radical idea in ancient Greece. The Epicurean philosophy spread widely in the Hellenistic world, particularly among people who were educated enough to appreciate its arguments but who felt powerless to change the political situation. It offered an attractive alternative to public life. Retreat, cultivate your garden, surround yourself with friends, and seek peace within yourself. Critics accused Epicureanism of being selfish, of abandoning civic duty, of teaching people to hide from the world's problems rather than solving them. But Epicurus would have responded that, in a world of vast empires and endless wars, the individual's ability to effect change was minimal, while their ability to destroy their own peace of mind through futile political engagement was enormous. Better to focus on what you could control, your own thoughts, your own desires, and your own small community. The Stoics and the art of endurance. If Epicureanism was a philosophy of retreat, Stoicism was a philosophy of engagement, but engagement on very different terms than the classical philosophers had imagined. The Stoics did not withdraw from public life, but they learned to participate in it without being destroyed by it, to act without attachment to outcomes, to serve without demanding success. Stoicism was founded by Zeno of Citium, who arrived in Athens as a young merchant around 300 BCE, according to legend. He was shipwrecked and lost his cargo, which forced him to remain in Athens. He began attending philosophical lectures and eventually founded his own school, teaching in the Stoa Poikile, the painted porch, a public colonnade in the Athenian agora. His followers became known as Stoics. The Stoic worldview began with a claim about the nature of the universe. Everything, they argued, was part of a single, rational, divine order. The universe was not chaotic or random. It was governed by logos, cosmic reason, a providential intelligence that structured all things. Human beings, as rational creatures, were microcosms of this larger order. We each carried within us a spark of the divine logos. From this metaphysical claim flowed an ethical one. To live well was to live in accordance with nature, which meant to live rationally, to align one's will with the cosmic order. Most human suffering, the Stoics believed, came not from external events, but from our judgments about those events. We suffer not because bad things happen, but because we label them as bad and resist them. The Stoics divided all things into two categories, those within our control and those outside our control. Within our control were our own thoughts, judgments, desires, and actions. Outside our control were everything else. Other people's actions, our reputation, our health, our wealth, even whether we live or die. Wisdom consisted in focusing all one's energy on what was within one's control and accepting with equanimity everything outside it. This led to a striking ethical position. A Stoic should fulfill their social roles, should be a good citizen, a good parent, a good friend. But they should not be attached to the outcomes. If you do your duty as a soldier and still lose the battle, that is not a failure. If you govern wisely and are still overthrown, that is not a defeat. The only true good is virtue, acting rationally and justly. Everything else, health, wealth, pleasure, even life itself, is indifferent, neither good nor bad in itself. This philosophy was enormously appealing to people living in the uncertain world of the Hellenistic kingdoms and later the Roman Empire. Stoicism taught that even a slave could be free if he understood that his true self, his rational soul, could not be enslaved. Even an emperor could find peace if he recognized that his power was temporary and that his true duty was to his own virtue, not to his legacy. The most famous Stoic texts that survive come from the Roman period. Epictetus, who was born a slave, taught that no one could take away your inner freedom, your ability to judge rightly. Marcus Aurelius, who was an emperor, wrote private meditations reminding himself that he was mortal, that his power was fleeting, and that he must act justly regardless of how others treated him. Stoicism did not promise happiness in the Epicurean sense of tranquility. It promised something harder and perhaps more valuable, the strength to endure anything, to remain upright and dignified even when everything around you was collapsing. In a world of political chaos, of arbitrary tyrants, of plague and war and disaster, Stoicism offered a kind of spiritual invulnerability. You could not control the world, but you could control yourself. The suspension of judgment, the skeptics and the limits of knowledge. The third great school of Hellenistic philosophy was skepticism, which took a very different approach to the problem of how to live in an uncertain world. The skeptics argued that the problem itself was the pursuit of certainty. People suffered because they held dogmatic beliefs, because they convinced themselves they knew the truth about things that could not be known, and then they fought and suffered when reality contradicted their beliefs. The solution, the skeptics taught, was to suspend judgment, to recognize that for every argument supporting a position, there was an equally strong argument opposing it. Knowledge was impossible, truth was unattainable, and therefore the wise person should give up the search for truth and instead cultivate a state of apouché suspension of judgment, which would lead to ataraxia, the same tranquility that the Epicureans sought but by a very different path. The founder of academic skepticism was Archelaus, who became head of Plato's academy in the 3rd century BCE and radically transformed it. Where Plato had sought certain knowledge of the forms, Archelaus argued that certain knowledge was impossible. Every philosophical system, including Plato's, could be undermined by equally strong counterarguments. A later school, Pyrrhonian skepticism, founded by Pyrrho of Elis, took this even further. Pyrrho had traveled with Alexander the Great to India and encountered Eastern philosophers whose indifference to the categories of Greek thought impressed him deeply. He taught that we should withhold assent from all propositions, that we should live according to appearances and customs without claiming that our way of life was based on truth. The skeptics developed elaborate arguments to show that knowledge was impossible. Our senses, they pointed out, were unreliable. A tower looks round from a distance and square up close. Wine tastes sweet to a healthy person and bitter to someone who is ill. If our senses contradict each other, how can we trust them to reveal truth? Reason was no better. For every logical argument proving a position, another argument could be constructed proving the opposite. Philosophers had been debating for centuries without reaching agreement on any fundamental question. This was evidence not that the truth was difficult to discover, but that the search itself was misguided. The skeptic's ultimate goal was therapeutic. By abandoning the dogmatic pursuit of truth, by accepting that we cannot know, we free ourselves from the anxiety and conflict that come from attachment to our beliefs. We can live peacefully, following convention and common sense, without claiming that our way is the only right way. Critics accuse the skeptics of self-contradiction. If you claim that nothing can be known, isn't that itself a knowledge claim? The skeptics responded that they were not making a dogmatic assertion, but simply reporting their experience. When they investigated any claim, they found equally strong arguments on both sides, and so they suspended judgment. They were not claiming this was the truth, but simply describing their practice. Skepticism, like Epicureanism and Stoicism, was a response to a world that no longer made sense, where the old certainties had collapsed and where the individual needed a way to navigate through chaos without being destroyed by it. All three schools, in different ways, turned philosophy from a tool for understanding and transforming the world into a tool for managing one's own inner state. The closing of the schools. How Christianity transformed philosophy for centuries. The great philosophical schools continued to teach in Athens and throughout the Mediterranean world. Stoicism, in particular, became the unofficial philosophy of educated Romans. Epicureanism had its adherents, and Plato's academy, though transformed by skepticism, survived. But a new force was growing, one that would ultimately transform and then eclipse Greek philosophy, Christianity. Christianity began as a Jewish sect in the Roman province of Judea. Its early followers were mostly poor, uneducated people who believed that a Jewish teacher named Jesus was the Messiah and that he had risen from the dead. The message was apocalyptic, emotional, and focused on faith rather than reason. It seemed to have nothing in common with Greek philosophy, but as Christianity spread into the Greek-speaking cities of the Roman Empire, it encountered educated converts who wanted to reconcile their new faith with the philosophical traditions they had been raised in. Was there a way to be both a Christian and a philosopher? Could the truths revealed by God be harmonized with the truths discovered by reason? The early church fathers, particularly in Alexandria and later in the Latin West, began to argue that Greek philosophy was not an enemy of Christianity, but a preparation for it. Plato's forms could be reinterpreted as God's thoughts. Stoic ethics could be baptized and presented as Christian virtue. Aristotle's logic could be used to defend Christian doctrine against heretics and pagans. This synthesis reached its peak in the work of Augustine of Hippo in the late 4th and early 5th centuries. Augustine, who had been trained in classical rhetoric and philosophy, converted to Christianity and then spent the rest of his life trying to understand his faith philosophically. He used Platonic ideas to explain Christian theology, arguing that God was the ultimate form, that the soul was immortal, and that reason, though fallen, could still glimpse truth. But even as philosophy was being absorbed into Christianity, the pagan schools were under pressure. In 313 CE, the Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity. By the end of the 4th century, Christianity was the official religion of the Roman Empire, and pagan worship was banned. The temples were closed. The sacrifices were forbidden. The philosophical schools were not immediately shut down. They were allowed to continue teaching, but they were increasingly isolated and marginalized. In 529 CE, the Emperor Justinian issued an edict closing the philosophical schools in Athens, including Plato's academy, which had existed for nearly 900 years. The last pagan philosophers, unable to teach in the empire, fled to Persia. This was not a sudden death, but the end of a long process. Philosophy had been transformed. It was no longer an independent path to truth, but a handmaiden to theology. Its role was to clarify doctrine, to defend the faith against rational objections, and to organize revealed truth into systematic form. The great questions that Socrates and Plato and Aristotle had asked were now answered not through reason and observation, but through scripture and tradition. The classical Greek belief that human reason, unaided by revelation, could discover truth about the world and about how to live, that radical, optimistic belief that had launched Western philosophy, was abandoned. It would not fully return until the Renaissance, more than 1,000 years later, when European scholars rediscovered the Greek texts that had been preserved by Islamic philosophers and began, slowly, to ask again the questions that the Greeks had first posed. The persistence of wonder. What the Greeks gave us, the great age of Greek philosophy, from Thales to Aristotle, from Socrates to the Stoics, lasted roughly 400 years. It was a brief, brilliant flash in the long night of human history, and yet its influence has been incalculable. Every time we ask a question and expect a rational answer, we are following in the footsteps of the Pre-Socratic. Every time we examine our own assumptions and test our beliefs through dialogue and argument, we are practicing the Socratic method. Every time we organize knowledge into categories and disciplines, we are using Aristotle's framework. Every time we try to endure suffering with dignity, we are drawing on Stoic strength. Every time we seek peace through simplicity, we are echoing Epicurus. The Greeks did not discover all truth. Many of their answers were wrong. Aristotle's physics was superseded by Galileo and Newton. Plato's theory of forms has been rejected by most modern philosophers. The Stoic belief in cosmic reason is not supported by contemporary science, but the Greeks discovered something more important than any particular answer. They discovered how to ask questions, how to think critically, how to demand evidence and coherence, how to follow an argument wherever it leads. They discovered that human beings, through the disciplined use of reason, could understand the world without appealing to gods or revelation or tradition. They discovered that truth was not handed down from above, but discovered through observation, experiment, and dialogue. They discovered that ethics was not simply obedience to divine commandment, but a rational inquiry into how to live well. These discoveries were made possible by a unique set of historical conditions: a fragmented political landscape, a maritime trading culture, democratic institutions that valued debate. These conditions did not last. War, conquest, and the loss of political freedom changed the nature of philosophy, turned it inward, made it a tool for coping with a world that could no longer be changed. But the example remained. The Greeks had shown that another way of thinking was possible, and though their schools were closed, though their books were lost or suppressed, though centuries passed when their questions were not asked, the memory of what they had achieved persisted. When the Renaissance scholars began to read Plato and Aristotle again, when the Enlightenment thinkers began to challenge religious authority in the name of reason, when the modern scientific revolution began to apply systematic observation and experiment to understanding nature, they were all, consciously or unconsciously, returning to the path that the Greeks had first opened. The rise and collapse of the first great minds of Europe is not just ancient history. It is the story of how human thought itself was transformed, how we learned to trust our reason, how we discovered that the universe is knowable. And it is a reminder that intellectual freedom is fragile, that the conditions that make philosophy possible can be destroyed by war, by tyranny, by the loss of hope that the world can be understood and improved. The Greeks showed us what is possible when human minds are free to question, to wonder, and to think. Their collapse showed us how easily that freedom can be lost, and their persistence, their refusal to be completely forgotten, shows us that the love of wisdom, once awakened, can never be entirely extinguished. Epilogue. The quiet walk in the ancient agora, and so we come to the end of our journey through the landscape of Greek thought. We have walked beside Thales, as he proposed that water was the fundamental substance. We have sat with Socrates in the agora, listening to him question the certainties of his fellow citizens. We have studied with Plato in the academy, contemplating the eternal forms. We have followed Aristotle as he catalogued the natural world. We have found refuge with Epicurus in his garden. We have learned endurance from the Stoics. And we have watched as the schools slowly faded, transformed by new times and new faiths. If you were to visit Athens today, you could still walk through the ancient agora where Socrates once taught. The Stoa of Attalos has been reconstructed, a long, elegant colonnade that gives you a sense of what these public spaces once looked like. The tourists pass through with their cameras. But if you come early in the morning or late in the afternoon, when the crowds have thinned, you can find a quiet corner and sit and simply be present in the space. The marble is still there, warm in the sun. The olive trees still grow on the slopes of the surrounding hills. And if you listen, if you let your mind grow still and receptive, you can almost hear the echoes of those ancient conversations, the patient questioning, the careful arguments, the shared search for truth. The philosophers are gone. Their world has vanished. But the questions they asked remain. What is real? How should we live? What can we know? What is justice? What is virtue? These are not Greek questions. They are human questions, and every generation must answer them anew. The Greeks showed us that we have the tools to seek these answers, that reason and observation and dialogue can guide us. And they showed us that the search itself, the examined life, is worth living, even if we never reach final certainty, even if the world around us collapses, even if we must, like Socrates, drink the hemlock rather than abandon the quest. Thank you for joining me on this long walk through the history of ideas, through the rise and the collapse of Europe's first great minds. I hope this journey has brought the beauty, the courage, and the enduring relevance of Greek philosophy to life. I wish you a calm and peaceful night, and may your own search for wisdom be filled with wonder and clarity. Good night. Yet even after we leave the quiet stones of the Athenian agora behind, something in the air still pulls us deeper into the world. The Greeks created not merely the physical remnants of temples and colonnades, but the invisible architecture of thought they left behind. For while ruins crumble and languages evolve, ideas have a strange endurance. They seep into the foundations of everything that comes after, shaping not only philosophies, but governments, sciences, religions, and even the way we experience ourselves. And so, before we let the night settle completely over ancient Greece, let us follow one more path, one that leads through the afterlives of these great thinkers and reveals how far their influence continued to spread long after their world fell silent. To begin, imagine the generations immediately after Aristotle. They inherited a Greece whose political landscape had been shattered by war and whose intellectual confidence had been shaken. The old city-states were no longer the centers of life or culture. The once fiercely independent Peleus had been swallowed into vast monarchies ruled from Alexandria, Antioch, and Pergamon. Yet paradoxically, this period of political decline ushered in one of the most extraordinary intellectual transformations in history. In Alexandria, a new city founded by Alexander the Great, a monumental institution arose that would carry the Greek passion for knowledge into realms. the earlier philosophers could barely have imagined. This was the museum part temple, part university, part research center, and its grand library, which housed hundreds of thousands of scrolls from across the known world. The scholars who worked there came from every corner of the Mediterranean. They catalogued texts, studied languages, wrote commentaries, and expanded the boundaries of mathematics, astronomy, geography, and medicine. Figures like Euclid, Eratosthenes, Herophilus, and Archimedes flourished in this new environment. They were not philosophers in the old Athenian sense. They did not wander marketplaces debating ethics or metaphysics. Instead, they built upon Aristotle's method of systematic inquiry, applying rigorous mathematical and empirical tools to unravel the universe. Euclid laid the foundations of geometry so thoroughly that his work would remain the standard text for 2,000 years. Eratosthenes, with astonishing precision, calculated the circumference of the earth using little more than shadows, angles, and reason. Herophilus dissected human bodies and made medical discoveries that would be lost for centuries after his death. Archimedes, the brilliant engineer from Syracuse, used mathematics to create machines of terrifying power and to glimpse, through his discoveries about levers, areas, and volumes, the deeper structures of physical reality. These thinkers were heirs of the Greek tradition, yet they worked in a world changed by empire. The cosmopolitanism of the Hellenistic kingdoms allowed knowledge to circulate more widely than ever before. Ideas from Egypt, Persia, Babylon, and Greece mingled freely. Scientific inquiry no longer belonged to a single city-state or philosophical school. It became a vast interconnected web. But even as scientific and mathematical thought reached new heights, the philosophical quest for meaning continued to evolve. The teachings of Epicurus, Zeno, and Pyrrho spread throughout the Mediterranean. Ordinary people, merchants, soldiers, statesmen, slaves gravitated toward these schools, not because they explained the cosmos, but because they offered survival strategies for the soul. In times of uncertainty, philosophy becomes medicine. Stoicism, in particular, flourished far from Greece itself. By the time of the Roman Empire, it became the guiding philosophy of emperors and statesmen. Seneca, advising Nero, wrote essays on the power of reason to restrain anger and fear. Epictetus, a former slave, taught that freedom comes not from changing one's circumstances, but from changing one's judgments. And Marcus Aurelius, ruling the greatest empire of the ancient world, wrote private reflections reminding himself that he was dust, that all things pass, and that virtue alone endures. Their stoicism was Greek at its course, steeped in rationality, disciplined thought, and the belief that the cosmos is ordered, but its emphasis shifted to the demands of a world dominated by empire rather than city-state democracy. For the later Stoics, the universe remained governed by logos, but the practical question was no longer how to live as a citizen of Athens, but how to live as a human being within an immense, often ruthless world system. Meanwhile, the ideas of Plato and Aristotle continued to develop in different directions. In the 3rd century BCE, a group of philosophers in Alexandria reinterpreted Plato's teachings into what became known as Middle Platonism, more mystical reading of metaphysics that saw the forms as emanations of a perfect divine source. Centuries later, this mystical Platonism evolved into Neoplatonism, whose greatest representative, Plotinus, taught that all existence flows from the One, an indescribable source of absolute unity and perfection. His writings inspired generations of thinkers, both pagan and Christian, who sought to understand the divine not through myth but through philosophical contemplation. As the Roman Empire Christianized, Neoplatonism became a bridge between Greek rationalism and Christian theology. Early Christian thinkers, seeking intellectual foundations for their new faith, turned instinctively to Plato and Aristotle. They found in Plato's vision of eternal forms a useful way to conceptualize God's unchanging nature, and in Aristotle's logic and metaphysics a framework for explaining doctrines like creation, the soul, and moral virtue. This synthesis produced some of the most influential works of late antiquity. Augustine, deeply shaped by both Plato and Plotinus, developed a Christian philosophy that centered on God as the ultimate source of truth and goodness, a theme that echoed Plato's form of the good. Later still, in the medieval Islamic world, scholars such as Avicenna and Averroes preserved and expanded Aristotle's works, applying his logic and natural philosophy to theology, medicine, and astronomy. Through them, Aristotle re-entered Europe during the Middle Ages, sparking the scholastic tradition of thinkers like Thomas Aquinas. In this way, the intellectual legacy of ancient Greece did not simply fade with the collapse of the classical world. It migrated, it transformed, it seeded new intellectual traditions in Christian monasteries, Islamic academies, and later, Renaissance universities. Every age interpreted the Greeks differently, but each returned to them because the questions they raised were universally, because the tools they developed remained unmatched. But Greek philosophy did more than influence scholars. It quietly reshaped the fundamental assumptions of Western culture. The idea that the universe operates according to natural laws. Greek. The belief that reason can uncover those laws. Greek. The practice of questioning authority, examining one's own beliefs, and seeking evidence. Greek. The distinction between appearance and reality, between what seems true and what is true. Greek. Even the very word logic from logos and ethics from ethos are Greek. For thousands of years, these assumptions simmered beneath the surface of Western thought, resurfacing powerfully in the Renaissance as Europeans rediscovered Greek texts in the libraries of Constantinople, Rome, and Islamic Spain. Artists, scientists, and philosophers embraced Greek ideals of beauty, proportion, inquiry, and reason. Humanism, the movement that placed human dignity, human reason, and human potential at the center of cultural life, was born from the ashes of Greek antiquity. The scientific revolution, too, was unthinkable without Greek foundations. Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, and Newton all owed intellectual debts to the Greeks, even as they overturned Aristotle's physics and Plato's cosmology. They were reviving something old as much as creating something new. The belief that nature is intelligible, that the world is not a stage for capricious gods, but a coherent system governed by laws. The Greeks began that story. Modern science continues it. Even today, when we debate ethics, metaphysics, politics, or consciousness, we are following trails the Greeks first cleared. Our universities are modeled on institutions like the Academy and the Lyceum. Our methods of argument descend from Socratic questioning. Our concepts of democracy, citizenship, and civic responsibility reflect Athenian ideals, even if transformed by centuries of history. And yet, for all this rational legacy, there is also something deeply human and fragile about Greek thought. It began not in laboratories or lecture halls, but in conversations, face to face, improvised, imperfect, full of hesitations and insights. Socrates speaking gently yet relentlessly with a confused young man. Aristotle walking with his students beneath the colonnades of the Lyceum. Plato imagining worlds that exist only in the mind's eye. Their philosophy was not a distant, abstract pursuit. It was a way of living. It required courage to question what everyone else accepted, courage to demand reasons where others appealed to tradition, courage to seek truth even when truth was dangerous. It cost Socrates his life. It cost many others their comfort, their social standing, their peace, and yet they persisted because they believed that the examined life was the most dignified form of existence available to human beings. So, as we close our final chapter on the first great minds of Europe, imagine once more that quiet walk through the agora. The sun is low. The stones beneath your feet are warm. The air smells faintly of olive leaves and dust. Somewhere nearby, a group of students debates the nature of justice. A merchant argues prices with a fisherman. A child chases a stray cat between the columns. And across this bustling, ordinary scene, a single idea hovers like a flame, that the mind of an ordinary human being is capable of extraordinary understanding, that reason can illuminate even the darkest mysteries, that wisdom is not the property of gods or kings, but a path open to anyone with the patience to walk it. The Greeks did not leave us answers, they left us questions, and perhaps that is the greatest gift of all, for questions endure. Questions invite dialogue. Questions lead us forward, generation after generation, across oceans and centuries, from Thales to Einstein, from the agora to the laboratory, from clay tablets to quantum physics. As long as we continue to ask them honestly, rigorously, bravely, the flame they lit will never go out. Thank you for journeying with me through this world of wonder and inquiry. May the night bring you rest, and may tomorrow bring you curiosity. Good night.